Hey everybody, it's me, Steve SCHNEE, the CD Junkie, and on this episode of CD Junkie, I'm going to be talking about one of the most original and exciting bands from the flourishing LA new wave scene of the late 70s and early 80s. And of course, I am talking about Jules and the Polar Bears. Now, Jules and the Polar Bears were around the same time as 2020, The Beat, The Knack, and all those great power pop bands. But Jules and the Polar Bears were definitely not power pop. There was something unique about them. There was something exciting. They may not have appealed to the power pop people, but I can assure you that they were pop, and they had power, and they had originality, and they had Jules Shear. Of course, Jules Shear was the singer-songwriter of Jules and the Polar Bears. Now, Jules had, I think he came from Pittsburgh or something, and then he made his way to Southern California, LA area. He was originally in a band called the Funky Kings, and they released an album in 1976. Now, Jack Temchin, who's a great songwriter, he was actually also a member of that band. And the Funky Kings wrote the original version of the song Slow Dancin', Swayin' to the Music. That was a hit for Johnny Rivers, I think, in 1977. Ian Gaume did a version of it as well. And that band split up. Jack Temchin, of course, went on and he wrote a bunch of songs with Glenn Frey of the Eagles, and he's a very well-known and respected singer-songwriter. Now, Jules formed the Polar Bears. The Polar Bears were Richard Berdice on guitar, David Beebe, I think, is how you pronounce it, on drums, either Beebe or Beebe. I'm just going to call him David from this point on. Keyboardist Stephen Hague, and of course Jules on guitar and vocals and songwriting duties. Now, they had studio bass players. They didn't have a full-time bass player until the third album, but we'll get to that. Now, I just bought the first Jules and the Polar Bears album because I bought anything from that scene that looked interesting. And of course, Jules and the Polar Bears, they didn't really look new wave, but of course, I bought it, and it was nothing like what I expected. I expected Yellow Pills, Rock and Roll Girl, that kind of power pop, and this was something just not like that. It was like they came from that universe, but on the way to Earth, they said, "Oh, I like Steely Dan too," and "Oh, let's throw in those chords." See, Jules is now known as a great songwriter. Now, with Jules and the Polar Bears, he was great too, but in Jules and the Polar Bears, he was writing from a different angle. He was writing these great melodies, whereas most artists would have fit 10 syllables into a line. Jules probably would fit 15 because he was saying what he needed to say, expressing himself in such a unique way. Like I said, it sounds like a mix of new wave and Steely Dan. Sometimes he sounds like Jackson Browne's unstable brother getting mad because he bit the cookie and it was raisins instead of chocolate chips. I mean, but he's just so unique, and this first album is absolutely fabulous. I mean, great songs on this include You Just Don't Want to Know, Black Fever Sleep, Shadows Break, Soul of Many Places, Following Every Finger, and this Wounded Bird CD has bonus tracks there. This is absolutely stellar. This came out in 1978. It still sounds unique. It still sounds like it's from a completely different universe, and it's truly amazing. I actually loved their next album, Phonetics, even more. This came out in 1979. This has Good Reason and A Smell of Home, Fate, Faded Red, and such great, great songs. Again, stellar, unique, and while everything was perfectly produced and everything was totally in its place, it still, at some point, it sounded like it was unhinged. It sounded like at any moment Jules was just going to burst out of the music, and it's really hard to describe. Now, in 1980, they followed this great album up with an EP called Economy Package. The 4 songs from Economy Package from that 1980 EP are essentially 4 of my top 10 favorite Jules and the Polar Bears song. It was so great. Luckily, this CD includes that Economy Package right there at the bottom. It's just really, really incredible. This was the second album, and guess what? Yep, that's right. They did have a third album that they recorded in 1980 after Economy Package, but it wasn't released until 1996. And at this point, they had added a bass player. I think it's either Gary Rickwine or Gary Richwine, but they became a quintet. And this album, it sat in the vaults for 16 years, recorded in 1980, released in 1996. In my opinion, it was darker, sadder, still great songwriting, still very emotional. That's the thing about Jules and the Polar Bears is, on the surface, people are going to go, they're quirky, or they're this, or they're that. But when it latches onto you, you can just feel the emotion. Sometimes you can smell the emotion if you turn it up a little bit louder, and it's just absolutely stellar. But this album does include some great songs, like Only Emotions, one of my favorites, and When the World Looks Old. And that is it for Jules and the Polar Bears. They only had these 2 official albums released, and then this came out in 1996. They are all extremely worthy to add to your collection because they are truly unique. It's very difficult to talk about them. I wish I could sit you down right now and play some of this stuff for you, but you can do that on your own when you go out into the interwebs and discover Jules and the Polar Bears for yourself. Now, Jules Shear, of course, he went off to many different projects. He still remains a great singer-songwriter. His songwriting remained great, but it got a little more streamlined. He realized, I don't need to cram 15 syllables into that line. So he wrote, like the Bangles, If She Knew What She Wants. He wrote All Through the Night, Cyndi Lauper, Whispering Your Name, that Alison Moyet had a big hit. He formed a band called the Reckless Sleepers as well, and that featured Steve Hawley, who previously in Paul McCartney and Wings, for the Back to the Egg period, which is my favorite period. And but just so much stuff. You really need to dig into him. Ian Matthews actually recorded an album of Jules Shear covers, and thankfully he focused mostly on the Jules and the Polar Bear years, because a lot of times when people cover Jules songs, they cover his post Polar Bears period. But this is definitely my favorite, but he's still a worthwhile artist. But definitely check out Jules and the Polar Bears any chance you get. Check out the Reckless Sleepers. Check out Jules Shear. That's it for this episode. I really appreciate you stopping by and listening to me babble about Jules and the Polar Bears. Remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, because the more you do that, the more chance I have to get this message and this music out to this big, wonderful, beautiful world. Stay safe, stay healthy, be well, and remember me, I'm Steve SCHNEE, the CD Junkie.